Hello, and welcome to Dyslexia Devoted, the podcast dedicated to building awareness, understanding, and strategies to help those with dyslexia. I'm your host, Lisa Parnello, dyslexia therapist and founder of Parnello Education Services. Join me as we dive into today's episode of Dyslexia Devoted. Hello, and welcome to episode 119 of Dyslexia Devoted. Today's episode is all about mistakes. And to be prepared, there might be a lot of them in this episode because this isn't podcast number 1 or 2. This is the third one I've recorded in 3 days, but the first one that is actually for you guys. I have 2 real-life friends with podcasts who've asked me to be on them as a guest this month for Dyslexia Awareness Month. So on top of all the other things I've been doing with the course launch and everything like that, I've also been guesting on other podcasts. And boy, am I ready for this month to be over, as much as I have loved every minute of it with you guys. And it is the whole theme of our podcast is all about dyslexia, and it's Dyslexia Awareness Month. I'm really excited that November has absolutely nothing special planned except for a week off of work for Thanksgiving. One thing that I learned from being on these different podcasts this weekend was just how much Dyslexia Awareness Month is really necessary. I was on 2 different podcasts that were hosted by educators who have teaching degrees, and the number of things that I said that completely blew their mind that they wish they knew about dyslexia was uncanny. The things that I just think of as normal because it's my entire world now, I realized were not normal to me when I was in a general public education classroom. And so I'm really glad that I was able to put out that educator's guide to dyslexia, and we had so many people sign up for the course, and I'm so excited that I had a personal goal for myself and I really hit it. And it is really helping me do what I set out to do, which is to spread the word about dyslexia. Okay, jumping into today's theme of mistakes. This is one of the things that it was actually inspired by a child last week who's not so little anymore. He was when I started. And the problem came up after a math test when him and his mom were going through and looking at the test and realizing the mistakes were just kind of silly mistakes. It had nothing to do with not understanding the math. So that's when we talked about preparing for mistakes. And that is really our big theme of this week's episode. We all make mistakes. We just have to plan for what we're going to do when they happen. Do we just stop, erase, and redo? Or is there a certain procedure we can put into place that this is what we always do to catch our mistakes because we know we're going to make them? And that's what we made a plan for this little boy, who's not so little. His plan will be that whenever he finishes his test, he has to go through and look for those little mistakes that he probably made. And it's okay to make mistakes. We just have to make a plan for how do we approach it knowing we're going to make those mistakes. And one of the big things I validated is that I screw up all the time. I just have a plan to catch myself before I screw up. So for me, I know one of the things I tend to mess up on is emails because I start and stop them sporadically. Now, if you ever worked with children, you know that sometimes they need your attention every 5 seconds. And other times, they're pretty good without you for a few minutes, and it's kind of weird just to sit there and stare at them. So it is not uncommon for me to start an email, wait for them to need my help, stop whatever I'm doing, help the child with what they need, let them keep going when they're on a roll and they don't need my help for a minute, and then I might jump back into my email and, finish typing the thing I was going to type. And what inevitably happens is there's usually some sort of thought that got stopped in the middle of. Because the priority, obviously, is the children that I work with, not the email that will still be there in 20 minutes. So I plan for those mistakes. Anytime I write an email, I whisper it back to myself to catch my errors. Which, by the way, comes to strategy number 2. If you are working with a child doing a writing assignment, it's really important that they read their essay or story back to themselves out loud. Now, you might be saying, can't they just read in their head? That's really loud and annoying if there's an entire classroom full of kids all reading it out loud. But there's actually a very concrete reason for reading it out loud, and there's a reason I will whisper my emails back to myself out loud. I'll mumble it so I won't drive whoever's around me crazy, but I do whisper it out loud. Because there's a cognitive shift that happens when you have to speak something out loud. When you are reading in your head, you know exactly what you meant to say, and your brain will sort of autocorrect to make sure it makes sense. But if you're reading out loud, your brain can't autocorrect your tongue. So if something is really choppy in your writing, it will come out all mumbly and stuttery because it's not natural to talk like that. If there is something that is a mistake in the actual writing. And this is where I help kids plan for their mistakes in written assignments. They will try to write something, they think it makes sense, but then as soon as they try to read it out loud to themselves, they go, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. And that's what we want them to do. We want them to hear when it doesn't sound right. And oftentimes, it is so much more effective when the kids can catch it themselves. There is something very different about catching your own mistake and fixing it than having someone else tell you that you screwed up. There is a bigger emotional reaction that happens when somebody tells you you messed up, compared to when you catch yourself like, oops, I'll just fix that real quick. When you catch it yourself, it's not nearly as torturous as when somebody else points out your mistakes. Now, there are exceptions to this, of course, people with really bad anxiety or people who have a low frustration tolerance because they've failed so many times and haven't gotten the right support and the right coping strategies. So there are obviously certain cases where that may not be true. But for the most part, it usually feels a lot better when you catch that you screwed up more than if someone else told you that you made a mistake. Now, the next strategy is validating that we always make mistakes. There's one little girl that I work with that is actually our biggest focus, is helping her know it's okay to make mistakes. She would always have really big reactions every time she made a mistake because she felt like she was always messing up. And instead, we realized that sometimes the reaction was a bigger problem than the actual mistake itself. The mistake itself, nobody would have even noticed had it not been for the giant reaction. And one of the ways we do that is we point out when we ourselves as adults make mistakes. I remember the first time I've told a couple of the kids, like, oops, I screwed up. That's my fault. That wasn't you. That was me. I made a mistake. Try it this way. And the kids started laughing or would have this look on their face of being completely dumbfounded. It is so rare for us as adults to tell kids that we screwed up. And our kids need to see that we screw up. When I say our kids, I mean our students, I mean our own children, I mean our own family member, kids in our lives. Kids need to see that mistakes are normal. We need to validate that that's part of life because kids learn from us and how we react to things. We can tell them over and over and over and over again to do something a certain way, but if they don't see us do it that way, they aren't so likely to believe it. So if you can model what it looks like to say, oh, I screwed up. That was my fault. That wasn't your fault. Let's go ahead and fix this. And sorry, I made that more difficult for you than it needed to be. And that is what the kids need to hear. They need to hear when it's okay, when something was made more difficult for them when it wasn't their fault. They need to hear that we make mistakes and we apologize for them. We need them to see that we fix our mistakes so that they can see that it's okay to mess up. We just got to fix our mistake. And that, I think, is the biggest thing we can possibly do for kids, is to validate the mistakes are normal. They're okay to happen. They should happen. That's part of life. We just show them that there's a basic procedure of what we do when we screw up. We fix it, we move on. You say sorry, you fix it, you do your best next time, and you try not to make that same mistake again. I can't even count the number of mistakes I'm sure that I've made this month, partly out of exhaustion from doing all sorts of masterclasses and course launches and every other Dyslexia Awareness Month activity I've put on my plate this month. But I've also validated for the kids when I've made those mistakes, when I said, oh, I'm so sorry, buddy. I was tired. That was my mistake. You didn't do anything wrong. I said it wrong. So let's recap our episode for today. First, we talked about the fact that it is okay for kids to make mistakes and they should just plan for them. They should know that they're going to happen and that it's normal and acceptable and what they're going to do when they do happen. For one of the kids, it was to go back and look for the mistakes at the end of his math test when he knows that he will transpose certain numbers and he knows he will make certain basic mistakes. That's his plan, is to go back and look at it before he turns it in. Is it fun? No. Do you want to just hand in your test and say, here, I'm done? Yes. But does it feel good to see how many mistakes you made when you got that test back? No, it doesn't. It feels pretty crummy to get it back, seeing that you messed up yet again. So if you can plan for that mistake and catch those mess ups, or at least several of them, before you hand in your test, it feels a lot better when you get your test back. For kids with writing, having them plan for the fact they're probably going to make some mistakes and read their writing out loud to themselves or to somebody else or to a stuffed animal or a dog or whoever, and catch the mistakes, because when it forces you to stumble and stutter, that probably means the sentence wasn't spoken naturally, and therefore there's probably some sort of mistake happening somewhere in that sentence. Then we also talked about how adults need to model for students when we screw up. We all mess up. It happens all the time. It's not really a big deal. We just have to model, how do we do it appropriately? How do we mess up, apologize, fix our mistake, however that may be, whether it's just a quick I'm sorry and a correction, or, completely redoing something and handing somebody a better version of it. What does that look like when we mess up? And how can we model that for kids? We can tell kids it's not a big deal, but if they see us making a big deal when we screw up, they're going to copy that reaction. How can we show them what it looks like to make a mistake and correct it and move on and not make a big deal out of it? Okay, that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode, number 119 of Dyslexia Devoted, Planning for Mistakes. See you next time. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you want to learn even more about dyslexia, check out parnelloeducation.com/courses. See you next time.